Recently in North America, there's been a rise in what's known as contingent faculty. That is, faculty members who are contracted and not on the tenure track. This presentation will outline some of the effects that this rise of contingent faculty has had on students as marked in the research. This research was conducted as a part of a course in which my assignment was to answer a research question of my choice, which in this case is about contingent faculty. There was no field research involved in this, so I'm purely reporting on others' results and adding my own critical interpretation. And it's also to share the findings with the audience, which is what I'm doing right now. I had to share findings with an audience who was suitable for this topic, and so I decided to reach out to people who are involved in academia in some way or expressed interest in it in some way. And one of those ways is through Reddit. Just for context, I am from Canada, and so is my university. So some of what I report is Canadian specific, but still most of the research on this topic comes from the United States, and so I will be presenting much of that. I'll mention, of course, when the research is Canadian, just so that you are aware. On your screen in front of you, you see what we'll be discussing today. So we'll be starting with some introductory material, who are contingent faculty and why is it specifically that I wanted to look at the relationship between those contingent faculty and student outcomes. Then we'll be talking about those student outcomes as I found when I conducted my research. We'll talk about the retention, how students, whether they stayed at their institutions or completed university over time or college of some sort. Then we'll look at the outcome number 2, which is student learning. What does learning mean in this context, and how contingent faculty affected that, as well as grades, and we'll be looking at them as somewhat separate. We'll explain why a bit later. We'll also discuss satisfaction, so how satisfied were students when they were taught by contingent faculty compared to other faculty. Of course, as I mentioned previously, we'll also talk a bit about the Canadian research, seeing what the context is in Canada relative to the rest of what was found. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks, some of my own insight and what I thought, and perhaps some areas for further research on this topic. So as mentioned, we'll be starting with an overview of who are contingent faculty, answering that question within the context of this current study. Prior to this study, I was not familiar myself with the term contingent faculty. I had known of adjunct faculty and sessional instructors, lecturers, all sorts of other titles that were used for contract faculty, also limited term appointments, but I was not familiar with this particular term contingent faculty, and when I started looking at the research, what I found was that this is the term that was widely used within the research. There was also a couple of others. NTTF, or non-tenure track faculty, was another one that appeared at least in one place. So anyway, to answer who the contingent faculty are, they are people who are not employed on a permanent ongoing basis. They are contracted in nature, so whatever the term of their appointment is, whether it's just for a single academic term or sometimes there are multi-year contracts, sometimes they're part-time, sometimes they're full-time. Either way, they're all considered contingent faculty. They also focus primarily on research, whereas when we look at our tenure track faculty, they do the teaching, research, and service, so all the areas of the university or college experience, depending on, of course, the type of institution we're discussing. So this, of course, primarily applies right now to the university context. Then we have our academic freedom, and just a brief mention of that. So tenure is a system made to protect academic freedom somewhat absolutely, right? So in any way, of course, there are still breaches of academic freedom, and those are often reported in news and whatnot when they happen. But because there is no renewal period of a contract or anything along those lines, it becomes difficult to find other ways to dismiss these faculty when institutions are not happy with their work product, whereas with contingent faculty, the contract cannot be renewed, and there can be some other external reason given for that, even if the underlying reason has something to do with the work product, research or teaching that this person conducted. I will note that this kind of relative mention of the strength of the academic freedom is from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, or CAUT. You see it on the screen in front of you, and they do say that tenure is the strongest protection of academic freedom, but also that contingent faculty should be given academic freedom, and that even when the contract is silent on the issue of academic freedom, or instead of a contract, collective bargaining agreement in certain cases where these faculty are unionized. Yeah, even if it is silent, they say that is not an excuse for an institution to infringe upon somebody's academic freedom. And academic freedom is what allows these faculty to explore these controversial topics, of course, in their research, but also in their teaching. So when we want to say something that may be a little more controversial in the spirit of education, it is helpful to have this academic freedom to back you up in the classroom. And there have been cases, of course, where this hasn't always been the case. The one thing is, though, that contingent faculty have been on the rise in the recent past, and there are numerous sources that indicate this. This source that you see on your screen is from Canada, but there are also similar results in the United States and even some other countries as well. And within the group of contingent faculty, another noteworthy thing is that some contingent faculty are further broken down into a group called adjunct faculty. And for the purpose of this study, adjunct faculty refers to the part-time subset of the contingent faculty. So these are people who are not hired on a very long-term basis, and who, maybe they're hired on a per-course basis rather than a blanket for a given period of time. So why then are we seeing this rise of contingent faculty? What's triggering it, and what's the reason? And there are a couple benefits for post-secondary institutions to hire contingent faculty, some incentives for them to do so. You see them on the screen in front of you, the first of which is, of course, lower cost. So I just picked an arbitrary amount, 8,000 Canadian dollars, seems to be in the ballpark of what a contingent faculty or an adjunct faculty might make in a Canadian post-secondary institution. If they are teaching 3 courses, which is in some cases defined as a full course load for teaching, that would be $24,000 for 3 courses, and in a 3-term year, that would be $72,000. Now, of course, not all 3 terms are as popular. Many students take the summer off, so in reality, it's likely to be even $8,000 or $16,000 less than that in this hypothetical situation. Compared to a tenure track faculty who might be making somewhere in the 6 figures. And of course, the tenure track faculty are also contributing to research and service of the university or the college in some way, although this varies, of course, by the faculty and how much service and research the institution needs will also vary by institution. So you can see that if they need more people just to teach students, it's very attractive to hire contingent faculty instead of appointing new post-secondary for the cost reason. But of course, there's also the flexibility in staffing levels. So looking at some Statistics Canada data, the number of students enrolled in the STEM fields has been increasing, whereas the arts-based or humanities have been decreasing in the recent past. And you can take a look at the references at the end for those citations. And so a school who had hired all tenure track faculty would be, in this case, overstaffed in their humanities because the declining enrollment, they wouldn't be able to dismiss the tenure track faculty as easily. Whereas if they hired contingent faculty, they would be able to reduce the number of contracts awarded and work with that. So you can see that it lets them be more responsive to have these contracts instead of having the permanent staff, because staff cannot be just moved to other departments. People have different areas of expertise, and so we have to be creative in how we find the flexibility for hiring decisions, which is one of those benefits as well. So being that this is a relatively new trend, I took a look at the literature or research available in when I took some other courses and found that much of it has to do with the faculty perspective. So how are they feeling about this trend? And it also had to do with kind of labor practices. So people should be getting paid the same amount for similar work, people might argue. This study in particular was trying to look at one of those gaps, which is the gap of not enough research on student outcomes and how are the students affected, right? Students are one of our main customer groups of post-secondary education, and so it is really important to think about this as we are making decisions about staffing levels at colleges and universities in order to come to the best decision for what the institution needs, and that's what this study intended to do. Of course, because it is a new and emerging trend, there are some research gaps, which we'll discuss throughout the study, but this is kind of what we were looking at and why we were looking at this particular factor. So what we are focusing on is what is known about this trend and how it affects students, and we'll take a look at that by a couple of things. And the reason that this is such a pertinent question is because this trend was driven for financial reasons, right? So universities were trying to become more efficient financially, and because of that, because this is how they address those finances, and it's coming from those sorts of needs rather than student needs, it's important to think about how it affects other things too, right? So it's not that by design students will be getting some sort of benefit from this change because it wasn't designed for that purpose, right? So and then even when we look at the media in the public discussion going on there, it seems to be centered on faculty discontent rather than student needs, right? So if we're looking at the recent case of York University in Canada, they had a strike with faculty, contract faculty, and teaching assistants, in which they're talking about that they would like, better employment opportunities at the institution. They want better access to the tenure track positions. And there may have been some discussion of student outcomes too, but this is what was coming through in the media, and the only student consideration was the students were missing class due to the labor action. So we need to really understand what, for these public discussions, what is the effect on student outcomes. So what student outcomes were looked at precisely? Here we see that the first student outcome was retention. So are students more likely to leave school if they're taught by contingent faculty members, right? We'll discuss it in more detail, but there may be reason why somebody might say that it's more likely that students would drop out if they're taught by contingent faculty members. So we'll look at that first. And then next we'll look at student learning. So do students learn as well from contingent faculty as they do from tenure track faculty? And you might say, of course, because tenure track faculty and contingent faculty are essentially equally qualified, right? A PhD is often required for either position. But is that necessarily true? And we'll take a look at that. And then we'll discuss the special case of grades. So grades are intended to be measures of student learning, and so if we were to use them as measures of student learning, there could be some justification for that. Of course, grades are also student outcomes that are specifically assigned by the instructor. So for that, we can look at and ask questions about, are contingent faculty grading differently, right? Are they trying to look for better student evaluations and giving grades more leniently? What's known about that? So we'll take a look at that as well. And then we'll finally discuss student satisfaction. So what are students experiencing in the classroom, and how is that transpiring and affecting their perception of their education experience? Almost like a customer service, thinking about satisfaction after that. So that's a bit of a different feel, but it's also important as we consider, of course, holistically how it affects students. Of course, there are other student outcomes that could be looked at. We can look at learning that is separate from the classroom, so out of classroom learning, right? Or contingent faculty around campus less and provide less opportunities for such things. But the scope of this study is to look at these specific 4 student outcomes, and we'll look at them each one by one. So as was mentioned, the first student outcome we'll look at is retention, where the effects of contingent faculty on student retention are unclear. Jagger and Egan here were a couple of the first to look, at least in the modern era, at the relationship between contingent faculty teaching and student retention. Their studies had a couple of different designs, but overall they found that contingent faculty negatively affected retention, so students were less likely to be retained. One of their studies looked at the relationship between retention and contingent faculty in 4 different types of institutions in the Carnegie classification, in all but the doctoral intensive. So of course, doctoral intensive being the outlier. But all the other 3 types that they looked at, they found that the contingent faculty association was negative for retention. And the other study they looked at was at community colleges and whether students were more likely to continue on to a 4-year college after attending a community college when the community college had a higher proportion of those contingent faculty. And again, they found the negative retention relationship there. Of course, there's correlation and not causation in those things. So let's see what some other studies said. So if we look at Muller, Mandernach, and Sanderson, students are more likely to be retained when taught by full-time contingent faculty than adjunct faculty. So I'd say that, within the subset of contingent faculty, the subset of adjunct faculty are less effective than the full-time. And this makes sense if you look at, the ideas of, for example, Vincent Tinto, where faculty should be a part of a learning community with the students, and they should all be learning from each other. So when the faculty are around campus less, as is the case for adjunct faculty just by the nature of their contracts, it makes sense that the full-time would have a better impact because they have more time to dedicate to their instruction and more time to dedicate to students, and they're also around the campus more and participating more in theory with the campus community. So seeing that, there's also Hollis, who found no significant correlation between full-time faculty and retention, so that's interesting and different. And there's also Deutsch, who looked at how the relationship was between retention and adjunct faculty after controlling for other factors, so looking at learner characteristics, age, race, all those sorts of things, and what the research says about retention on those factors and controlling for them. What Deutsch found was that there was no significant difference in retention after that. So that kind of points to that some of the earlier results could have been from correlation rather than causation. There could have been an external third factor that wasn't considered in earlier studies, and so it's interesting there as well. And then there is finally Hutto, and Hutto found that part-time faculty was correlated with successfully completing a course with a grade of C or higher. So that's how Hutto defined course retention, so staying within the course and successfully completing it with the degree C, and that's what Hutto found. So interesting result too. It directly kind of contradicts Jaeger and Egan, although it does look at a different type of retention than the others. So we see here there's a big mixed bag of results. What this means to me is that, of course, there can very well be a relationship between retention and contingency, but to me it seems that this might be external factors or unrelated factors that happen to coincide with contingency that may be causing this, and maybe the difference isn't quite so pronounced, and if it is a big difference, it's not really showing through in these studies. So interesting there. And now we look at learning and what the research says about how contingent faculty affect that factor. Cox, McIntosh, Terenzini, Reason, and Lutovsky-Quaye found that faculty were more approachable, full-time faculty, rather than the adjunct faculty, which makes sense. Adjunct faculty are not around campus as much, and you know, perhaps they have other stressors, they have other employment they have to concern themselves with, and so this was something that was interesting that was found, and of course it is assumed that this approachability does have an impact on student learning. And to kind of illustrate that, I'll share an anecdote from my life where when I was an undergraduate student, I did a math degree, and what I found is that I would constantly be going towards the math department for help, but certain faculty members were more approachable than others, and they made themselves more available. And there was actually a faculty member who was so approachable that many of the students, myself included, would often go to him for help with other courses, and he didn't mind helping us out with the other courses. So that was actually very interesting, and so we learned more, and I have a feeling that if that person wasn't there, I would rather have not asked for help, rather than going to the instructor for the course, because some of the instructors weren't quite as approachable, and I would not have felt comfortable admitting that I was having difficulty with the course content, right? So approachability I can see helpful for student help seeking, which would help student learning, right? So it's kind of an indirect relationship, but it definitely is there. Figlio, Shapiro, and Soter looked at the students at Northwestern University. Interesting result there. They found that students learn better from contingent faculty at Northwestern University. So the one thing to note is they looked at how students performed in subsequent courses taken in the same discipline. To do this, and so that's what they found. Of course, Northwestern University is a bit of an outlier. Their students come in a bit stronger because they are a highly selective institution, and they also were very clear in their article, in their journal article that they had, that the faculty there have longer term relationships with the institution, and so it isn't likely that this results can be generalized widely, but it's still an interesting result to look at. Corrigan found that adjunct faculty use more effective instructional strategies overall. But it was also found that adjunct faculty tended to use less innovative assessment methods. So more innovative teaching with the, more effective, not necessarily innovative, but more effective teaching with the less innovative assessment methods. It's a bit of a disconnect, right? So students were taught using those innovative methods and then assessed using the more traditional, multiple choice essays. It may not have translated as well, right? So just an interesting note in the instructional strategies chosen by instructors, and what we know about the effectiveness of those, right? So perhaps it would be better if adjunct faculty used the same types of equally as innovative of solutions for instruction as well as assessment. And then there's also Van der Kloot as well as many collaborators. This is a Canadian study found, and they were reporting on themselves. So they were all contingent faculty, and they submitted this article saying that they experienced in their own lives barriers to being able to participate in the scholarship of teaching and learning as a part of their overall professional development. And so with these barriers to really engaging academically in their teaching activities, it's reasonable to assume that, they weren't able to reach their full potential as instructors. Not saying that they necessarily had poor performance, but that if we want our instructors to be as best as possible, we need to make sure that they have access to all the professional development that supports that. So what was the relationship between grades and contingent faculty? Johnson found that contingent faculty tended to assign higher grades. Of course, there could be a couple of reasons for that. Are they inherently grading differently, or is learning better? Right? If we look at Figlio and Figlio's collaborators, it could be indicative of better teaching, right? Because that study showed that at Northwestern University that was the case. So, of course, if people are more effective instructors, you'd expect the grades to be higher, all other things equal. So that is a possibility. But overall, there just was not a lot in this area to be able to say much else. Of course, we looked at Hutto previously, and Hutto mentioned that for retention, in the course retention, students were more likely to successfully complete a course with grade of C. And this implied a reinforcement of Johnson's findings, because if it's more likely for the students to be getting a grade of at least C, then does that mean that the students are getting higher grades overall? Of course, it doesn't necessarily say that, but it could be the case. And now again, we're looking at student satisfaction. We're seeing that there's not much research in this area. Again, looking at Johnson didn't really find any definitive outcomes there, or didn't report on any, rather. But implied in the article that contingent faculty may be more apt to change their behavior to artificially inflate course evaluations, right? So maybe pointing to the reason why higher grades were assigned in Johnson's study, which would be sensical for those cases where the faculty are trying to compete for a new contract renewal or a different contract, or perhaps tenure track positions, and they want those positive student evaluations to reinforce the quality of their teaching, right? Of course, it would be unethical if they were changing their behavior for the sake of increasing the satisfaction in that way. By assigning higher grades, for example, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen just because it's unethical. Heller took a bit of a different approach. Heller looked at the actual course evaluations and found that they weren't necessarily asking the right questions to best support the adjunct faculty, right? So if there's questions about office availability and office hours, and the adjunct faculty aren't even assigned an office, right? How is that fairly assessing their availability? So what Heller was suggesting was making sure that when we are getting students to complete course evaluations, we ensure that the evaluation that they complete is going to apply to their instructor, to give the instructor the best feedback to improve their instruction, but also to get a good sense of how the adjunct faculty are meeting, or contingent faculty overall, are meeting the expectations of their role, and aren't being assessed unfairly on things that aren't within that scope. Mueller also found that contingent faculty had better course evaluations than adjunct faculty, which is consistent, with this idea that people who are around more, have more time to dedicate to the instruction, are going to give those better results. And then Thayer, Myers, and Nugent found no significant difference between tenure-track faculty and adjunct faculty in kind of a social work setting, and that was a bit of a more extensive study with a couple hundred looked at. So interesting results in student satisfaction. Of course, there's not a lot there. It would perhaps be something to look at in closer detail. Also looked at the NSSE, so National Survey of Student experience, and the right questions aren't necessarily being asked there to get any useful insight for this particular question. So that could be also a source of further data down the road sometime, but may indicate why there is this lack of information in this area. And then to bring it back to the Canadian context, as I mentioned, I would. So Field and Jones in Canada, of course, there's not as much research. Canada is a much smaller country than America. But looking at what there is, Field and Jones found that there were some obstacles in place that get in the way of faculty success in the area of teaching. So what kind of barriers did they find? For example, some of them reported being hired last minute and only receiving information last minute that may have been helpful for their course. So things like when did they receive a sample syllabus in order to prepare their own syllabus based on previous instructors, right? So things like that. With Field and Jones, they found were kind of barriers as well. They also found another example, 33% of precarious faculty compared to 18% of what they termed as traditional faculty indicated teaching courses outside of their area of expertise, right? So are we setting our contingent faculty up for success when we're asking them to teach outside that area of expertise? Interesting question, interesting thing to look at. Van der Kloot and the collaborators, as I mentioned previously, discussed some barriers to engagement in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So we've already discussed that. And then Brownlee encountered barriers gathering data from Ontario institutions. So Brownlee was trying to get head counts of how many contingent faculty are there, how many tenure track faculty are there, and had some very big barriers in order to do that. Was asking people, was trying to do the freedom of information requests, but found that administrators were getting in the way, or these offices that were in charge of the freedom of information requests weren't releasing the information as readily as they should have been, considering what the law in Ontario is. So when we can't even gather the information, it is difficult to conduct research. So a recommendation is for institutions to ensure that there are not these barriers to gathering information, so that we can get a better idea of what these outcomes are and have the best report there. But of course, we're seeing there's not much, so more research is required. Field and Jones have done a bit, and we see here Van der Kloot as well as Brownlee, but there is opportunities for more. It would be interesting to see what else there is in the Canadian context. So what can we take away from this study? So first off, there were a couple of studies that gave some examples of things that institutions can do in order to ensure that contingent faculty are as successful as possible. So this is kind of acknowledging that contingent faculty, whether we like it or not, are here to stay. It's just not feasible to suddenly increase the budgets of all these institutions that are so financially constrained already to hire more tenure track faculty. So assuming that contingent faculty are here to stay, what can we be doing to support them? So Kim found that the department head, as a leader of the department, has kind of a great opportunity to really support those contingent faculty, so including them in faculty professional development opportunities, right? So Kim reported on a physical therapy program, and what Kim found was that they invited their contingent faculty to faculty retreats. They had mentorship between faculty, so people who've been there a while compared to new people who are just joining the institution, right? So all these sorts of things really added up and really made it for a good work experience for the faculty and allowed them to be the best they could be. Kizar also had a list of factors that are helpful. Things like making sure that there's an adequate orientation, right? We're welcoming people to a workplace. We need to make sure that they have the information they need to be successful. And that's the case in any workplace, not just academia. But what Kizar is finding is that, it's not necessarily happening all the time. Also, professional development, making sure they have access to that. That's the teaching and learning offices, that's the access to conference funds, that's the all sorts of things like that that can really add value to and immerse the faculty in their work and really get them in the zone and focused and getting the best outcomes they can. And then Kizar also mentions autonomy, and so sometimes there were cases where adjunct or contingent faculty are hired last minute, and they're given the syllabus and they're given the evaluations as they were in previous years. So giving them the autonomy to make the decisions on their own is something that Kizar recommends as high value and high impact kind of practice for people. But of course, research is required of how to make the best of this, and so hopefully we'll see more in the near future, but we really need to get that more research in order to get the best outcomes possible. Anyway, that concludes the high-level overview of what I found as I went through this particular study. It was very interesting and kind of challenged what I had thought would be the case, right? So we found that there were no significant differences in many cases, a lot of contradicting research. There were also a lot of single institution studies, right, which aren't necessarily going to be the best for generalizing the results to the broader context of academia. But like I said, it did make me challenge my assumptions. So I'd assumed, that, the best contingent faculty will be the ones who are successful in those competitions for tenure track appointments. But based on student outcomes, that's not necessarily the case, certainly. I don't know about in other ways, but this was not something that I had expected as an outsider, an outsider from the perspective, of course, that I am not a faculty member myself. So it was really good to have those assumptions checked, and it kind of helped me see that this is more of a problem because it's not necessarily that an issue about quality. The quality of the instruction is the same, so why are things like pay not the same? So it gave me that kind of an insight. There is still some research ongoing. But it seems that the research has slowed down in this area. So from 2008 to about 2013, there were several different published results, but it seems to have slowed down. And a lot of the more current research is, again, that rhetoric about, fair labor practices and the faculty perspective and those sorts of things. So it'll be really interesting to get back to student outcomes and look at that in a more formal way. Especially in Canada, where there really isn't that much. We're seeing in Canada, there's recently a strike at York University that went on for many weeks, with contingent faculty being on the picket line for, they wanted better access to tenure track appointments and things like that. So understanding the contingent faculty holistically, student outcomes, other outcomes, is really important. And then why is what we need to know more about, right? So why are these outcomes the way they are? There were also many correlational studies that were found in the research. We see, that there were these kind of findings, right? Contingent faculty are just better for learning for whatever reason. But why is that the case, right? Is it that contingent faculty are on average younger, right? As maybe they relate better to the students. Who knows what it is? And that's what we need to really find out in further research, and hopefully we'll be able to answer those sorts of questions and see more about that. So anyway, again, interesting results. More is needed, but hopefully this provides a good overview. Of course, I have my references here, so not all of these references were alluded to in that you just experienced, but that were looked at for the purpose of the study. So it's very possible that there's some that I may have missed, which would be interesting to hear about. And feel free to pause at any point if you'd like to know more about a source. I will also say that there were some situations of access certain articles that aren't included on this list, but due to my levels, that was just not possible. So I apologize if there was something big that was missed, but anyway, these are what was looked at. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and have a wonderful rest of your day.